Alright, Swifters, this video is going to have less polish. It's the video that I'm producing for our quarantined class, but what we're going to be doing is dealing with TableViewSchool here. So in this playlist, we're going to go through some of the basic concepts in table views. Now, I'm going to be demonstrating some stuff using a data set with some Game of Thrones characters as students in our alleged student app. So you can find that at bit.ly/swift-students, all lowercase, and then your challenge exercises are going to be using party planner data that you can find at bit.ly/P, party planner data, all one word. And we're going to learn how to set up table views with dynamic cells inside of a view controller, how to pass data into a view controller for editing, how to create a new element for a table view's data source array, how to pass edited elements back to the table view, how to cancel, how to do an IB action for an unwind, how to pass a new element and add it to the table view, how to delete rows, and how to move rows. So with that said, apologies for the lack of polish that you're going to see in these videos, but this playlist hopefully is helpful for you as you try to grok what's going on with table views. Welcome to TableViewSchool. We're going to start our table view project. Let's launch Xcode. We're going to create a new project. We'll call it Student List. I'll save mine to the desktop, and I'll make it full screen. There is a table view control, but that's just going to limit what you can do. So here we have our basic view controller. We'll look up table view. We see table view here. We'll drag this over. I'm going to constrain this to 0, 0, 0, and 0. Add 4 constraints. Now you can add prototype cells either by clicking on one here, or you could go up and just drag a table view cell over. Now with the table view cell selected, you want to set the identifier to cell. You also have styles that you can set. We're going to work with a basic style. And now we're just going to create an IB outlet for the table view because we need to refer to the table view in our code. Not the table view cell, but the table view is what we need an IB outlet for. So I'm just going to control drag over from table view, let go, and the practice is to call this table view lower camel case. That's done. For our table view code, you want to remember Delegate Datasource, Delegate Datasource. So first we need to do is set up our delegate and our data source. We usually do that in view.load. So I'll say TableView.delegate equals self, TableView.datasource equals self. Then we'll set up our protocols. We usually do that in an extension. So I'll say extension, and you follow that with the name of the class. So the class is ViewController. And then remember, Delegate Datasource, Delegate Datasource. So if you say TableView, Delegate, Xcode will write UI TableView Delegate, TableView Datasource, Xcode will write your UI TableView Datasource. Xcode will think for a moment. It'll say, hey, if you adopt these protocols, then you need these particular functions associated with them. So let's add the stubs. Fix it. So again, what's happening here? Well, with protocol-oriented programming, components of your code are able to delegate tasks to other components of your code. Now, Apple writes most of the code for table views and handles things like the animation of the table view, scrolling the table view, but there are a bunch of things that you're going to have to handle as well. And that includes putting stuff inside of the table view and telling the table view where you're going to get your data from. So even though, if we look over here in main storyboard, Apple handles most of what goes on inside of a table view, when the table view needs stuff done that it can't provide on its own, it needs to make a request and say, hey, please do this for me. So the table view is in charge of most of what happens here, but it can delegate responsibility for certain things. That's what the delegate is all about. So by saying TableView Delegate and TableView Datasource here, we're saying, hey, for our table view, the delegate and the data source are going to be self, which is this view controller. And when the table view needs something, iOS is going to allow the table view to send messages back. Now, if you want to use table views, you have to adopt the protocol. These are the rules of the road for using table views. Apple says, hey, If you want to use table views, then you have to have these particular functions. That's what protocols do, is they enforce the rules that are necessary in order to use particular techniques in your code. So we've got these two functions here, and in order to work with data in a table view, you've got to have data. So one of the things that's going to change from app to app, and everything that you see here is probably going to be the same from app to app, but what's going to be different is you'll have a different data source depending on the app that you're writing. Well, this app, we're going to have some bogus student information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called students here. So I'll say students equals, and then I'll put an array of strings inside of square brackets. Then if you open a browser and go to bit.ly/swift-students, you see a bunch of bogus students in here that I put in. You might recognize these names if you're a fan of a particular HBO series that involves dragons and zombies. So I'm going to copy all of the names in here. Highlight from Eddard Stark down to Grey Worm. Command-C. Head back to Xcode. Paste those names in between the brackets. Then I'll highlight with Command-A. Do a Control-I. That fixes the indent and everything looks good. So now that I've got a data source, I can then put the contents inside of this code that my table view will send a message to run when it needs information. Now this first one here, number of rows in section, will be executed automatically by iOS when it needs to know the number of rows in a table view. So what we're going to do here is we're going to return an integer, and that integer specifically is going to be the number of elements inside of the array that we're using as our data source. So I'm going to say in here, return students.count. So again, from app to app, this is going to be pretty much the same here, except for this particular value, the student's value. You'll put a new array name in here so that you can return the total number of cells in whatever array you're using as your data source. Now down here, what we need to do, cell for row at, is called whenever the table view needs to set up a cell. And the table view doesn't create a cell for every single element in the array. Because when you think about it, the TableViewCell has lots of information in here that you don't necessarily need to keep track of for potentially what could be hundreds or even thousands of elements in your data source. So for example, every TableViewCell has fonts and background colors and all sorts of other information, font sizes. And so what Apple does to keep things efficient is you do have to keep track of all of the elements in your data. So we have an array here, but Apple will reuse any cells that are on screen. And when something scrolls off of the top or scrolls off of the bottom, Apple will then dequeue or reuse that cell, and it's going to ask you to populate it with new information for whatever element in your data source is scrolling onto screen. So what we're going to do here first is we're going to create a cell. So we'll say let, and we could name it anything, but we'll create that constant cell called cell, and we'll say table view. And the thing to remember here is DQ. If you type in DQ, we want DQ reusable cell. So TableView.DQ reusable cell. We typically select this one here with identifier and for index path. Now press enter here. What is the identifier? Well, that's the value that we had typed in on our main storyboard for our cell's name. So if I click on cell, go up under the attributes inspector, and I see the identifier here for the cell is capital CELL, I want to make sure that this is exactly in here with the same exact name. No extra spaces in here before or after. The spelling and the capitalization has to be the same. So I'll go back over here. If you want to be super sure, you can just paste over whatever you copied out of the identifier field inside of your attributes inspector. And then what is the index path? Well, again, this function gets called by the table view when it needs you to set up a cell, and it actually passes in values. This index path here is the index path, which is the row and the section number of the cell that your table view needs to get set up with data inside of it. So we can just take this index path value here that's actually being passed in for us and put it in here for this index path. This is upper camel case. It says it wants type index path, but this is the lower camel case, the value that's coming into the call of this function. So we'll say lowercase index path, and then down on the next line, we'll just return the cell. See, what we're returning here is a UI table view cell. That's what the table view is going to need. Now, what we haven't done in between here is we haven't set up the data that's going to go inside of the cell. So what we'll do here here is we'll just refer to the cell that we just created, cell dot. And then what we want to do is we want to access this field that's inside of the cell. If we take a look in the main storyboard, we didn't name this. iOS gives us this automatically if we use the basic cell type that you see right here. So we get a label that's inside, and even though we don't have an IB outlet created for this name, this is part of a basic table view format that iOS will allow us to create, and we can refer to that in our code as, if you type in dot and type in text, you can see text label shows up. That's the name of the main textual content of the table cell. Now that's, again, if you use any of Apple's formats. If you use custom cells, that's a whole different ball game where you've got to create a custom class. But for this, we can go ahead and grab this text label. There's also one called detail text label too, if you were to select something that had, and we'll do this in our exercise here, got to click on the cell first instead of the basic style. If you selected the subtitle style here, this is your main text label, this is your detail text label. You could also click back on the cell here and select any of the other styles in here that have right and left. This is the text label, this is the detail text label. But in this particular example, we use basic. In the next example, when we deal with a party planner, which is going to be your challenge problem, you deal with subtitle. But I'll click on basic, go back over here to the view controller, and again, when I type in text label like this is being picked off by code completion to say, hey, you're probably referring to that label inside. That's exactly what I want. So I'm going to press enter here, type in text, say equals, and then what do we want to put in there? Well, what we want to put in is going to be the element of the array of students. So we'll say students here. And then what we're going to pass in is the particular index path.row, which is going to give us the element of our array, which acts as the data source to populate the text property of the text label. So we'll just say students, open bracket, index path.row, close brackets. Now we see this all set up here. What's going to change from app to app? You'll have a different data source. You may have a different class name, and if you have a different class name, you need to make sure that your extension has a different class name here too, because we're extending the existing class. This is your data source, which will change from app to app, but everything else will remain the same. As long as you're using one of Apple's cells, like our basic cell in here, then you'll set it up this way. This will create a UI table view cell. If we option click on top of cell, we can see that's the type that we're creating, and that's what we're returning down here. And then down here in cell, if you want to populate just the text label, you refer to your data source, but it's going to be at indexPath.row. Now, the one thing that we forgot here, you can see that the little highlight is in text. It needs me to put a question mark in here. You can have Apple go ahead and fix that if you want to. This is Apple's way of saying, hey, there's a chance there might not be a text label in there if you delete this by accident, or you didn't select this particular type here, you're using a custom class. By putting a question mark in here, the app's not going to crash. It's just going to say, okay, do I have this? Is it non-nil? Yes, then I'm going to jump over to where the text is, and I'm going to allow you to put some contents inside of this value. So now let's build and run and see how things look. And what we should see are all of the names in our class showing up in our table view. And here we go, looking good. The first name is Eddard Stark. The last name is Grey Worm. They're all showing up. Now, just to really underscore what's going on when our table view leverages the protocols and makes calls to either find out the number of rows in section or asks for a cell to be set up and sent back, let's put in a print statement in here. So in this first one, we'll say print, and we'll say number of rows in section was just called, returning rows as our row count. And we'll take students.count and put this right in here. And just so that this shows up, we'll put in some emojis. So I'll option command space. I think this is cool that we're calling number of rows in section, so I'll put in cool emoji. And then down here, we'll put in another print statement so that you can see that we're calling and we're setting up a cell. Cell for row at is building cell at indexPath.row, string interp with value, string interp. And I'll put in the first string interp as indexPath.row, and the second string interp I'll put in students indexPath.row. And I think this is cool, so what we'll do is we'll put a fist bump in here. And now let's build and run, and we see if we expand this, iOS is called number of rows in section 3 times. Why does it call it 3 times? I have no idea. iOS and the table view has a reason to call it. Typically, it will only call number of rows in section when it's first setting up the table view to show, so this doesn't get called again, but everything is working behind the scenes and we're passing it an appropriate value. So there are 36 students in our class. Now what about cell for row at? Well, we start out with 0 being Eddard Stark, then 1 being Robert Baratheon, all the way down. What's the last one that we have in here? Tyrion Lannister, which is number 16. Now we have more than 16 rows in here, but we haven't been displaying them on screen. Watch what happens if I click and start to scroll up. So I see Khal Drogo, Peter Baelish, and I can see that all of a sudden I need to request the information for cell at 18 and for cell 19. Now what has happened here? Well, we've dequeued the reusable cell. We've actually taken the 2 cells that have gone off screen here, and the table view sends a message to its delegate, which is our code, which runs this function cell for row at when it needs a cell to be repopulated and sent back so that it knows what should be inside of it so that it can display that cell. That's exactly what's happening here for 18 and 19. What if we start to scroll in the other direction? Well, we can see we go back to 1 and to 0 here. We're reusing the cells that have scrolled off the bottom up top, and we're populating them with first with Robert Baratheon, which is number 1, and then Eddard Stark, which is number 0. If we scroll very quickly in the other direction, you can see what's happening here. Why all of a sudden did we show 20 and 19 here after we went up to 35? There was a little bit of a bounce, and it preloaded some of the stuff that could go off screen. So if we see what's up here, well, I guess Davos Skeworth is the last one, but when we have that little bounce in there, that's what's going on. If we start scrolling in the other area, we can see again Peter Baelish and Khal Drogo start to show up. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. We can see delegation in action. iOS is handling most of what's going on with your table view, but when it needs information like, hey, how many elements are in my data source, it's going to call this and we're going to pass this back using the count of our data source. Or when it needs to reuse a cell, it says, hey, send me back a TableViewCell that's already set up. So that's why we create the cell, we figure out which cell we're going to dequeue, we populate it with a value from our data source, and then we return it, we send it back. And in case you need some hints in here, constrain the table view to the sides of the safe area with constant 0, 0, 0, and 0. You want to set the identifier for that cell. You want to set the table view style initially to basic, but why don't you use subtitle for Party Planner, and then make sure that you create an IB outlet for TableView. So here are your steps in here. This is the stuff that might change from app to app. So we used basic in our first app. We're going to use subtitle in our second app and our Party Planner in here. Most of the time you're going to call your TableViewCell cell, but this is something that you want to pay attention to as well, just in case you type in something different than capital CELL in here. Now, we always ask ourselves a certain set of questions before working with something new in iOS. Do we need frameworks for table views? No. Do we need a delegate and data source for table views? Yes, in both cases. Do we need protocols? Yep, we got a TableView delegate and a TableView data source protocol. Swift will add these 2 methods that are required, and the other things, we'd set them up on our previous screen. So when you think about setting things up, our solution to our previous app, the things that are going to change when we work on our new app are going to be the things that are highlighted in green. Potentially, your class name is going to be different, although we'll keep the name ViewController for our ViewController. You're going to have a new data set, so instead of students, you'll have Party Planner information. Your extension would have a different name if you were extending something other than ViewController. And then the other things that are changed are related entirely to the data source that you're using. So students is our data source here. We have a different one for Party Planner. And here's our students data source, which is updating your text label. This is going to change if you have 2 labels in here. We'll only worry about the first label so far, though, in our Party Planner. And remember, if you change your identifier in your cell, you want to make sure that you update it here as well. So hopefully that's clear. And if it is clear, now you got a challenge. So now let's apply exactly what you know by going through exercise 5.1, which is to create the party planner. So what you're going to do is refer to the data that's at this page, create a string array called party items that will list all of the items that you could bring to this great party that we're going to run at the end of the semester, assuming we're out of quarantine. And when you're done, it should look like this. So don't worry about that empty subtitle that you see down there. We're going to fill that in with blanks in just a bit. Why don't you pause, see what you can do, and then resume. We'll have the solution in the next video.